Gideon Prescott rode into Calico Flats, New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1882 with $3 in his coat pocket, a bullet wound in his left side that had not fully healed, and a quiet, settled certainty that he would not be riding back out again. That was the plan. That was the whole of it. Find a corner of the territory far enough from the life he had lived, sit down somewhere the wind could finish what the bullet had started, and let the world move on without him. He had chosen Calico Flats because the name had sounded forgettable on the map, because no one he had ever wronged or loved or buried would think to look for him there, and because dying in a forgotten place seemed kinder than dying somewhere anyone would have to remember it. He arrived on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, Jennie Hayes had already ruined everything. He had not even made it off the main street before he heard her. The sound came from inside Callaway's Dry Goods, a two-story frame building with a sun-bleached sign and a porch that leaned slightly to the left, as though it had been debating lying down for years. First there was laughter, wide open, full-bodied laughter, the kind that did not care who was listening. Then there was a crash, followed immediately by the most enthusiastic string of opinions Gideon had ever heard delivered at that volume, and that speed through what he assumed was a wall made of only modest lumber. "I am telling you, Mr. Callaway, that barrel has been sitting in that exact position for 6 months, and you have tripped over it twice yourself. So I will not stand here and take a lecture on where a woman ought to be looking when she walks through a room. Miss Hayes. Because the barrel is in the wrong place, the flower is in the wrong place, and frankly your whole left wall is in the wrong place, and I would have told you that in October if you had asked me, which you did not, Miss Hayes, please, and I am paying for the flower, so you can put whatever expression that is back wherever it came from." There was a beat of silence. Then the door opened and out she came. She was perhaps 24, tall for a woman of the era, with brown hair escaping its pins in 3 different directions, and a dusting of white flour on the front of her blue calico dress that she had not noticed or did not care about. She was carrying 2 heavy paper-wrapped parcels under one arm and had a third balanced on top of them, all while pulling on a worn leather glove with her free hand, which was a physical achievement Gideon found himself watching with something close to disbelief. Her eyes were dark brown and quick, moving the moment she stepped onto the porch, and they found him immediately, this unfamiliar man sitting on an unfamiliar horse on the main street of a town where apparently she knew everyone. She looked at him the way a person looks at something that doesn't belong yet and wants to understand why. "Morning," she said, without breaking stride down the porch steps. "Morning," Gideon said. She glanced at his horse, at the rolled bedroll behind his saddle, at the way he was sitting slightly wrong, favoring one side though he was doing his level best to hide it, and then back at his face. "You just arriving or just passing through?" she asked. "Arriving," he said, which was true, even if his intentions regarding the word were different from what she likely assumed. "Well," she said, pausing at the base of the steps and shifting her parcels into a more stable configuration. "The hotel is 2 blocks east. Mrs. Garner runs it. She will charge you fair and she keeps a clean house. The livery is just past the farrier. Old man Tucker runs that. He will try to charge you extra for the water, but do not let him, it's included." She tilted her chin toward his left side without quite pointing at it. "And Doc Alderman is on the north end of Sycamore Street, 4th building. There's a blue door. You look like you could use that last one more than the first 2. Gideon stared at her. She gave him one more appraising look, as if confirming her own assessment, then turned and walked away down the street with her parcels and her flour dusting and her escaped hair, talking, he could already hear it, to someone else entirely before she had made it 20 steps. He watched her go. He did not know why. He found the hotel. He found the livery and did not let old Tucker charge him for the water. He did not find the blue door on Sycamore Street because he had not come to Calico Flats to be healed, and he went asleep that night in a small, clean room at Mrs. Garner's hotel with the window open, and the desert wind coming through, and the absolute firm intention of minding his own quiet business until there was no more business to mind. He woke the next morning to shouting from the street below, not alarmed shouting, not the shouting of danger or crisis. It was the shouting of someone who had a great deal to say and had found an audience, and the voice was one he had already catalogued somewhere in the back of his reluctant memory. He looked out the window. Jennie Hayes was standing in the middle of Calico Flats Main Street arguing cheerfully with a man on a wagon about the price of hay, and from the expression on the man's face, she was winning comprehensively and had been winning for some time. Two men on the boardwalk across the street were watching with the specific expression of people who had seen this before and were enjoying it anyway. A dog sat at her feet and watched her with what appeared to be complete admiration. Gideon closed the window. It did not help as much as he'd hoped. He went downstairs for breakfast because a man had to eat, even a man with limited plans, and he found himself seated at a long table in Mrs. Garner's small dining room with 4 other boarders. A traveling salesman, a young mining surveyor, an older gentleman who said nothing and ate methodically, and Jennie Hayes, who was already there and already talking. She was talking to Mrs. Garner about a problem with the schoolhouse roof, and the conversation had clearly been going on for a while, because Mrs. Garner had that look of cheerful resignation that spoke of long acquaintance. "If the county doesn't send the money by June, I'm going to write to Santa Fe myself," Jennie was saying, tearing bread with more energy than the bread strictly required. "There are 14 children in that schoolhouse and a roof that leaks in 3 places, and it has been 2 years since the petition." "You've already written to Santa Fe twice," Mrs. Garner said, setting down a plate of eggs. "Then I'll write a 3rd time. Maybe they'll read it this time." "The 4th letter I wrote to Mr. Hartwell about the road actually got a response. It took 8 letters to get that response, Jennie." "Yes, and the road got fixed, didn't it?" This was, apparently, unanswerable because Mrs. Garner simply shook her head with great affection and went back to the kitchen. Jennie looked up then and noticed Gideon, who had taken the seat at the far end of the table with the specific intention of occupying as little space as possible. "You found Mrs. Garner," she said, as if this confirmed something. "I did," he said. "Did you find Doc Alderman?" He paused with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "I don't need a doctor." "You're sitting the same way you were sitting on your horse yesterday," she said, with the calm matter-of-factness of someone stating that the sky was blue or the morning was cool. "Shifted right, protecting the left. That's either a rib or something worse." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those quick dark eyes and zero particular concern for the fact that she had just pointed out something he had worked to hide. "Jennie Hayes," she said, and extended her hand across the table the way a man would, direct and immediate. He shook it because what else was he going to do? "Gideon Prescott." "Where are you from, Mr. Prescott?" "Texas, most recently." "What brings you to Calico Flats?" "Quiet," he said, which was the truest answer he had and the one he expected would end the conversation. She tilted her head. "You picked an interesting place for quiet. This town has 14 children, a disputed property line between the Miller Ranch and the Avery claim that involves monthly shouting and me." She said this last part without any particular vanity, just as another piece of relevant information. "But it does have nice sunsets." "I'll take the sunsets," he said. She smiled at that, and it was a sudden, genuine thing that changed her whole face, and he looked away from it and concentrated on his eggs. He found the blue door that afternoon. Not because Jennie Hayes had told him to. He had made the decision of his own accord, prompted by the fact that, when he had tried to saddle his horse that morning, his left side had seized so badly he had spent a full minute breathing against the stall wall, which had been undignified and also alarming enough to briefly override his intention to let things take their course. Doc Alderman was a small, precise man of about 60 with spectacles and the practical, unshockable manner of a frontier physician who had seen everything. He unwrapped Gideon's side, examined the wound with focused attention, and then sat back and looked at him over his spectacles with an expression that was not alarmed but was very honest. "When did this happen?" "6 weeks ago." "Who treated it?" "I did." "With what?" "What I had." Doc Alderman sighed with the resignation of a man who had heard this many times. "It's infected, not badly but enough that it's been fighting you. The original wound itself," he paused, choosing words. "Whoever shot you, Mr. Prescott, they came close to something important. You've been fortunate." Gideon said nothing. "I'll clean it properly and give you something for the infection. You'll need to let it rest. No hard riding, no heavy labor for at least 3 weeks. Can you manage that?" "I've got nowhere to be," Gideon said, which was the truest thing he'd said in months. Doc Alderman looked at him with the eyes of a man who had lived long enough on the frontier to recognize a particular kind of quiet in a person. He did not press it. He simply cleaned the wound with carbolic, applied a proper dressing, and handed over a small paper packet of medicine with instructions. "Come back in 4 days," he said, "and eat something. You've lost weight." Gideon paid him and walked back out into the Calico Flats afternoon sun, which was warm and vivid and unreasonably beautiful for a town a man had arrived in to disappear inside of. The thing was, dying quietly required a certain cooperation from one's surroundings, and Calico Flats was proving deeply uncooperative. It was not just Jennie Hayes, though she was the loudest and most persistent element. It was the whole texture of the place. The woman at the general store who pressed a jar of peach preserves on him because he looked thin. The old man who played fiddle outside the saloon on Friday evenings and was genuinely excellent at it. The 14 children who attended the leaking schoolhouse and who ran through the main street on Saturday mornings like a controlled catastrophe, all shouts and bare feet and enormous ambition. The way the Sangre de Cristo Mountains caught the late light and turned colors that had no business existing in a world that had also produced the kind of things Gideon had seen and done. He stayed in his room a great deal. He told himself it was the doctor's orders. On the 5th day, he came downstairs for breakfast to find Jennie Hayes at the table again with a stack of papers in front of her, and ink on her fingers, and a crease of focused frustration between her brows. "Still here," she observed without looking up. "Apparently," he said. "I thought you might have moved on." "Where would I go?" She did look up at that briefly with something searching in her expression that he did not want examined. "I don't know. You seem like a man who's been moving." He sat down and poured his own coffee from the pot Mrs. Garner had left on the table. "What are you writing?" The shift in her face was immediate and pronounced. The frustration brightened into something animated and full. "The 4th letter to the county land office about the Garza family's property claim. The Garzas have been on that land for 11 years. They built every structure on it. They have receipts and witnesses. And some man from back east with a territorial land grant he got through the mail is trying to say it belongs to him. Does he have a valid claim?" "He has a piece of paper," she said, with the kind of precision that held a great deal of contempt inside a very small space. "The law and a piece of paper are not always the same thing." "No," Gideon agreed. "They're not." She looked at him again. "You know about land disputes." "I know about the law not always doing what it ought to." He said it simply, without drama, and she heard the weight inside it and did not poke at it. "The Garza family has been good neighbors since before I came here," she said instead, returning to her letter. "Maria Garza taught me to make proper tortillas because I was doing it completely wrong. I owe her adequate representation at minimum." "Are you a lawyer?" She smiled at her paper. "No, I'm a schoolteacher. But I can read, I can write, and I am completely undeterred, which in my experience is the more important combination." He found himself looking at her for longer than he had planned to. At the ink on her fingers and the escaped pin in her hair, and the absolute focused energy of her, over a stack of papers on behalf of neighbors she cared about. And he looked away, because looking at Jennie Hayes for too long produced a feeling in his chest that sat right next to the old wound, and ached almost the same way, and was considerably more dangerous. He went back to his room and stared at the ceiling, and had a very firm conversation with himself about the nature of his situation and his intentions, and the importance of not becoming attached to a place or a person when one had arrived in a town for the specific purpose of not becoming attached to anything. The conversation was not very effective. He was at Doc Alderman's for his 4-day check when he learned about the schoolhouse problem in more detail. Not from Jennie, but from the doctor himself, who mentioned it the way people in small towns mention everything, as simply part of the shared knowledge of the place. Jennie Hayes has been trying to get that roof fixed for 2 years, Doc Alderman said, examining his side with professional satisfaction at the improvement. County ignores her. Territorial government ignores her. She's been putting buckets in the schoolroom when it rains and sending the children home when the weather is genuinely bad. Last February, she kept 3 children at her own house for 2 nights because the storm came up too fast for them to travel back to their families. That's not a sustainable arrangement, Gideon said. No, the doctor agreed. It isn't. But she keeps doing it because the alternative is those children not being educated, and Jennie Hayes would burn down her own house before she let that happen. He replaced the dressing with practiced hands. Infection is clearing. You're healing better than you deserve to, given how you were treating it. You're the second person to suggest I don't deserve good things, Gideon said. I didn't say that. Doc Alderman looked at him over his spectacles. I said you were treating the wound badly. That's different from what you deserve. Gideon went back to the hotel. He sat in the small room with the open window and the desert wind and thought about what a person deserved and what a person had done, and whether those two things could ever fully separate from each other. He had ridden as an enforcer for a cattle baron named Carver Holt in West Texas for 3 years. He had collected debts and moved people off land that Carver Holt wanted and delivered messages that were not really messages and been, in the politest possible framing, a blunt instrument in a ruthless man's hand. He had told himself for a long time that he did not do the worst of what Carver Holt's operation did. He had told himself the line he stood on was clear enough to count for something. Then Carver Holt had decided that a particular family, the Delacroix family, a father, a mother, 2 grown sons were enough of an obstacle to his plans for a specific piece of land that they needed to be removed with more emphasis than Gideon's kind of work involved. Holt had sent other men for that. But Gideon had known it was coming, and he had not stopped it, and he had told himself his knowing and not stopping was not the same as doing. And then the Delacroix property had burned on a Tuesday night in November, and the family had been driven off at gunpoint, and one of the sons had tried to fight back and been shot for it and had lived barely, but had lived. Gideon had walked away from Carver Holt's outfit the next morning. One of Holt's other men had shot him in the side 2 days later for the insult of it, and Gideon had decided, somewhere between the initial pain and the slow 3-day ride that followed, that he had used up whatever store of second chances a person was issued, and that the cleanest thing he could do was remove himself from the world before he became involved in causing any further damage to anyone in it. That was the plan. That was the whole and complete plan. And it had been a reasonable plan, arrived at from a not unreasonable assessment of his own history, and it had been proceeding adequately until Jennie Hayes had walked out of a dry goods store with flour on her dress and immediately identified his wound at 40 yards and pointed him toward a blue door. He was not healing because he wanted to heal. He was healing because Doc Alderman was good at his job, and his body, apparently, had not received the same message his mind had sent. He decided, lying on that clean bed with the desert wind coming through the window, that he would be civil, and he would be quiet, and he would do nothing to pull himself further into the life of Calico Flats, because the kindest thing a person with his history could do for a town like this one was to remain peripheral to it. He stuck to that resolution for almost 2 weeks, which was longer than he'd expected. It broke on a Friday afternoon when he came around the corner of Sycamore Street and found Jennie Hayes standing on a ladder propped against the side of the schoolhouse with a hammer and what was clearly not enough of a plan for what she was attempting to do with it. The schoolhouse was a modest single-room building with adobe walls and a pitched roof that showed, even from street level, the specific kind of damage that came from 2 winters of inadequate repair. There was a section near the front where the wood had warped and separated, leaving a gap that would let in everything from rain to the considerable southwest wind. Jennie was on the 3rd rung of a 4-rung ladder with a board balanced under one arm and a hammer in her other hand, and the entire configuration had the specific wobble of something that was going to become a problem very shortly. "What are you doing?" he asked, stopping on the street below her. "Fixing a roof," she said, with the calm of someone who had already thought through all available objections and dismissed them. "On your own. The county has not seen fit to send someone else. That ladder is not anchored. I know." She shifted the board, the ladder swayed. "I've been managing it." "Miss Hayes, Jennie," she said, automatically and with some exasperation because apparently she had told him this and it hadn't taken. "Jennie," he said, "that ladder is going to go out from under you." "Only if I lean too far left, and I'm not." The ladder went left. It was not far and it was not catastrophic, but it was enough that she grabbed for the wall and the board went one direction and the hammer went another, and she ended up pressed flat against the schoolhouse wall on a ladder that was now sitting at a 45-degree angle from where it had started, breathing hard and clearly reassessing several recent decisions. Gideon had crossed the street and steadied the ladder before he had consciously decided to do it. He had one hand on the base and one hand on the side rail, and he was looking up at her, and she was looking down at him. "Thank you," she said, after a moment, with the particular tone of someone who is grateful but does not particularly enjoy needing to be. "Come down," he said. She came down carefully and stood on the ground and looked at the board that had landed in the dust and the hammer that had landed further away, and she had the expression of someone recalculating something she had been certain about. "I need to fix that section before the rains," she said. "The summer storms come through in July, and if that gap is still there, I'm going to lose the whole east wall." He looked up at the schoolhouse roof. He looked at the gap. He looked at the lumber she had leaned against the wall, which was actually the right kind of lumber if you had the right approach to the problem. He looked at his own left side, which had been healing cleanly for 10 days and which Doc Alderman had said was progressing well, and he thought about the firm resolution he had made regarding peripheral involvement. "Do you have roofing nails?" he asked. She blinked. "I have regular nails. Those will do for the temporary fix. For a proper repair you'd want, how much lumber do you have?" she told him. He walked around the building, assessed the damage with the practical eye of a man who had grown up working with his hands before he had grown up into other things, and came back to where she was standing watching him with an expression that was slightly uncertain, as if she was not sure whether to be grateful or to ask him questions she was not sure she would like the answers to. "I can fix that section," he said, "and the one on the back wall. It'll take the afternoon." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have to do that." "I know." Another moment. "Why are you offering?" He could have said something manageable. He could have said it was the practical thing to do, or that he had time on his hands, or that it was the least someone should do when a woman was about to fall off a ladder. Instead, what came out was, because 14 children shouldn't sit in a leaking building. It was the same language she had used. He hadn't planned it. Her expression shifted into something warmer and more complicated, and she nodded. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He fixed the roof. It took the full afternoon and part of the evening, and Jennie Hayes did not go home. She handed up boards when he needed them and held the ladder steady and passed up nails in handfuls, and at some point produced a canteen of water that she handed up without comment. She talked while he worked, not at him specifically, but in that way she had where she was simply thinking out loud, and the world was invited to listen if it chose. She talked about the Garza land case, which was going to the county commissioner in 3 weeks. She talked about 2 of her students who were particularly bright, and for whom she was trying to source more advanced reading materials. She talked about a drought 2 summers before that had hit the smaller ranches hard. He worked and listened and occasionally said something back. And when the light started to go and he climbed down for the last time and she looked up at the repaired roof with visible relief and quiet satisfaction, he felt something he had not felt in long enough that it took him a moment to identify it. Useful. He felt useful, for a reason that was not in service of someone like Carver Holt. "That will hold," he said, "through the summer rains and into fall. Next spring you should get a proper carpenter in to do the whole east side." "I will write to the county," she said, with a tone that suggested the county did not know yet what was coming for them. He picked up the tools and she picked up the leftover lumber and they walked back along Sycamore Street in the cooling evening air. And the mountains to the east were doing exactly what she had promised about the sunsets, burning pink and copper against a sky that was going deep blue overhead. And Gideon Prescott, who had arrived in Calico Flats to die quietly, walked beside a woman who was too full of life and purpose and heat to allow the world around her to settle into anything less than its full potential. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "In Calico Flats." "4 years," she said. "I came from Ohio. I answered a notice for a schoolteacher in the New Mexico territory, and they sent me the position and I packed 2 trunks and got on a train and then a stage and arrived here and thought," she paused, smiling at some memory, "I thought it was the emptiest, biggest, strangest, most beautiful place I had ever seen, and I have thought that every single day since. No family back east who wanted you to stay. My mother worried. She still worries. I write to her every 2 weeks. My father thought it was very fine of me, actually. He was an adventurous man. Something passed over her face at the past tense. He died 3 years ago, the heart. I'm sorry." "He would have liked it here," she said, with the matter-of-fact honesty she brought to everything. "He would have liked the size of it." They reached the hotel. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked at him in the last of the light. "Thank you, Gideon," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and it did something to the air between them that he noticed and she appeared to notice too, because there was a brief pause where they were simply standing there in the evening warmth with the sounds of Calico Flats around them. "Good night, Jennie," he said. She went home. He went upstairs. He lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. In the weeks that followed, Gideon Prescott did not die. This was becoming increasingly evident and also increasingly complicated. His side healed. Doc Alderman pronounced him sound at the end of the 3rd week with the specific satisfaction of a physician whose patient had confounded expectations. He could ride without pain, could lift without the seizing, could breathe all the way to the bottom of his lungs. His body had, apparently, decided to continue without consulting him. He could have left. There was no reason, on the surface of things, that he was still in Calico Flats. He had $3 when he arrived, and he now had somewhat more, because he had found work without entirely meaning to. Tucker at the livery had needed temporary help, and then the Miller Ranch outside of town had needed an extra hand for spring branding, and he was good with horses and competent with the work, and people in frontier towns did not ask many questions about a man's history if he showed up willing and able. He told himself he was staying because of the work. He told himself he was staying because the territory was vast, and one town was as good as another when it came to quiet. He told himself a number of things that he did not entirely believe, all of which conveniently failed to involve saying the name Jennie Hayes. She had a house on the west edge of town, a small adobe with a kitchen garden out back, and a porch with 2 chairs on it, and a wind chime made of old tin that rang in the afternoon breeze. He knew this because he had walked past it on the way to and from the Miller Ranch and had not specifically slowed down, but he had also not specifically not slowed down, and the wind chime sound had become something he listened for. She had a habit of sitting on that porch in the evenings after school with a book or her correspondence, or simply with nothing, watching the light change. He knew this too. He knew it the way a person who is trying very hard not to pay attention to something still ends up knowing it through the sheer persistence of the thing being there. The Garza land case came to a head on a Thursday in late May. The county commissioner, a man named Beaumont who came down from the county seat in a good coat, and with the air of someone who had traveled a long way to be somewhere he considered inconvenient, held his hearing in the small room behind the town hall. Gideon had not intended to attend. He found himself attending anyway, because Jennie was there with her stack of letters and her ink-stained fingers and her expression of calm, focused determination, and he had been walking past the town hall when he had seen her through the window, and something had simply not allowed his feet to continue. He stood at the back. He watched. She was extraordinary. She laid out the Garza family's claim with methodical precision. The 11 years of continuous occupation, the structures built, the land cleared, the taxes paid, the community standing, the witnesses present in the room. She had apparently found a case from another territory involving a similar conflict over land grants versus continuous settlement that she cited with perfect confidence to a commissioner who had clearly not expected this level of preparation from a schoolteacher in a small town. The man with the Eastern land grant had a lawyer. The lawyer made arguments about the legal primacy of the grant document. Jennie Hayes, who did not have a law degree and had not needed one, argued back with such clear-eyed logic and such specific knowledge of the relevant territorial statutes that the lawyer's arguments grew progressively less confident over the course of the afternoon. Commissioner Beaumont ruled in favor of the Garza family. He did not look entirely happy about it, but he ruled it. Maria Garza cried. Her husband, a quiet, dignified man named Louis, shook Jennie's hand with both of his and said something to her in Spanish that made her eyes go bright and wet before she blinked it away. Their adult children embraced her, all 3 of them, while she laughed and protested and looked more moved than she was trying to show. Gideon was still standing at the back of the room when she turned around and saw him there. Something crossed her face that was part surprise and part something softer. "You were here," she said, crossing to him as the room began to empty. "I was passing by," he said. "You were not passing by. You were standing at the back of a county hearing." "I was passing by slowly," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled, that sudden, real smile that changed her whole face, and he felt the ache in his chest that was not the old wound at all. "Come have supper," she said. "Maria is making a celebration dinner, and there are going to be approximately 30 people and enough food for 100. You cannot say no, she has already seen you." He looked past her. Maria Garza was indeed looking at him with the specific expression of a woman who had made up her mind. "All right," he said. The supper at the Garza Ranch was the first time in years that Gideon sat at a table with people celebrating something good, and did not feel like he was watching from outside a window. Louis Garza opened a bottle of something he had been saving for a good occasion. The children, the Garza grandchildren, ranging from tiny to nearly grown, ran between the tables set up under the cottonwood trees. Someone brought a guitar and someone else had a fiddle, and the evening turned musical and warm and smelled of roasted meat and wood smoke and the flowering desert. Jennie sat across from him for part of the evening and beside him for another part of it, and they talked in the way they had been slowly, incrementally talking over weeks of breakfasts and street conversations and shared work. Easily, with the rhythm of 2 people who had been listening to each other carefully enough to understand how the other one thought. He told her about growing up in East Texas, the farm his parents had worked, the 3 younger siblings he had in varying degrees of contact with. He told her about how he had left at 17 to make his own way, and how making his own way had taken him in directions he had not anticipated and had not always been proud of. He was careful. He did not tell her about Carver Holt or about the Delacroix family or about being shot in the side while riding away from the worst version of himself. But he told her enough of the edges of it that she could see the shape of it if she was paying attention, which she always was. She told him about Ohio, about her parents, about the particular hunger she had felt growing up in a small, neat town where the roads all ended in the same familiar places, for something larger and less certain. She told him about the first year in Calico Flats, which had been lonely in ways she had not admitted to anyone back home in her letters, and about the moment that had shifted, when Maria Garza had knocked on her door 6 months in with a plate of food and an offer of company, and had become the kind of friend that made a strange place begin to feel like home. "Were you never frightened?" he asked. "Coming out here alone?" "Terrified," she said, simply and without embarrassment. "But I find that being terrified and doing the thing anyway is the only way I know how to do anything." So, the evening deepened. The stars came out over New Mexico in their extraordinary numbers. The guitar and fiddle found a reel, and several people danced on the flat ground near the cottonwoods. Jennie was pulled into the dancing by one of the Garza daughters, and danced with enthusiastic incompetence and clear delight. And Gideon watched her and felt something shifting inside him that he had no language for that was not terrifying. On the ride back to town, she had borrowed a horse. He had his own. They rode side by side in the warm night with the stars overhead and the desert silence around them that was not actually silence at all, but was full of crickets and the soft sound of hooves on the dry earth. "Gideon," she said after a while. What happened to you?" "Before you came here." A pause. The horses moved steady beneath them. "Something I'm not proud of," he said. "Did you do the harm yourself or did you let it happen?" The question was so direct and so precisely located that it startled a near laugh out of him. "Both," he said, "in different proportions at different times." "Is the person who did it still who you are?" He thought about that for longer than was comfortable. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's the most honest answer I have." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a reasonable answer," she said. "Most people who need to ask that question don't bother." They reached the edge of town. At the turnoff that led to her house, she pulled up her horse and looked at him in the starlight with those quick, honest eyes. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. "In Calico Flats, whatever the reason." She turned down her road before he could answer, which was probably good, because he did not have an answer that would have been safe to give her. June arrived, and with it the first real heat. Gideon had extended his arrangement at Tucker's Livery into something approaching regular employment, and had picked up additional work at the Miller Ranch when they needed it. He was not, by any honest accounting, a man who was planning to leave. He was also not, by any honest accounting, a man who had said anything about staying. The two states existed simultaneously in a peculiar suspension, like a thing balanced on a fence rail that had not yet committed to one side or the other. What changed everything, or rather, what forced the balance to tip, arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the form of a man named Cole Prout. Cole Prout rode into Calico Flats on a roan horse, with the kind of face that had spent a decade absorbing sunburn and hard living, and he had two companions with him who had a similar look about them. Gideon recognized the type before he recognized the specific man, and the recognition produced a cold, specific alertness in his body that was very old and very practiced. Prout had worked for Carver Holt. Not at the same level as Gideon. Prout was the kind of man who did the things Gideon had been telling himself he hadn't done. He was also, Gideon realized with cold clarity as Prout scanned the main street, and his eyes paused on a specific figure, here for a reason. The figure his eyes paused on was Jennie Hayes, who was standing outside the schoolhouse talking to a parent with complete obliviousness to the three men on the street. Gideon did not know why Prout was here. He did not know if it was connected to him or to something else entirely. What he did know, with the specific knowledge of a man who had spent 3 years reading intentions in faces, was that Cole Prout did not visit towns for innocent reasons. He followed at a distance and observed. Prout and his men went to the saloon. Gideon, who did not use the saloon for drinking, went there for information and found, through the careful mechanism of standing near an open window, that Prout was asking about land north of town, the Avery claim specifically, and its relationship to the Miller Ranch. There it was. Carver Holt was expanding his reach into the territory. The Avery claim and the Miller Ranch together represented a water access that Holt had, apparently, decided he wanted. Gideon knew the tactic because he had been used to execute it. He was not going to be used to execute it again. He was done with that. What he needed to think about was what it meant that Prout was here and whether Prout had known Gideon was here, which was possible, if Holt's operation had ears in enough places, and what that meant for the people of this town. What it meant for Jennie Hayes, specifically, who had been vocally and documentarily involved in defending property rights in this county, and who had the kind of relationship with the Garza family and the Avery family and everyone else in Calico Flats that made her a known quantity to anyone trying to understand the lay of the land. He went to find her. Not alarmingly. He did not want to alarm her without more information. But he found her that evening on her porch with her book and sat on the second chair, which he had never done before, and she looked at him sideways with the look she used when she had noticed something was different. "There are men in town," he said. "3 of them. I know one of them or know of him. He works for a man in Texas who makes a business of acquiring land through pressure." She set down her book, her face sharpened. "The Miller Ranch and the Avery claim, together they control the North Creek access. It's valuable. William Avery has been ill," she said. "I didn't think anyone outside the county knew that yet. Someone does now." He looked at her steadily. "I want to tell you something about where I came from and what I did, because it has some bearing on what's happening here, and I won't sit in your second chair and hide it from you." She was very still. The wind chime moved in the evening breeze. "All right," she said, he told her. Not all of it, but the significant parts: Carver Holt's operation, the nature of his own work there, the Delacroix family and what he had known and not stopped and had carried the guilt of since, and the man with the gun in the West Texas dust and the decision he had made while bleeding and riding north. He told it flatly, without self-justification, in the same tone he would have used to describe weather or terrain. When he finished, she was looking at the middle distance past the edge of her porch, her hands still in her lap, her book forgotten. "Is that why you came here to die?" she asked. The bluntness of it hit him like cold water. "What?" She looked at him then. "You weren't looking for quiet, Gideon, or not only that. You had the look of a man who was done. I saw it when you rode in." She said it without sentimentality and without particular gentleness, the way she said everything that was true. "I thought about it after. I've thought about it several times." He looked at the desert going dark beyond the edge of town. "Yes," he said, "that was the plan. And now," a long pause, "the plan has been having some problems." She was quiet for a moment. "Carver Holt's man, Cole Prout, he works like you did, pressure and paper. He works like I did in the first stage. If the pressure doesn't take, he works differently, more violently." "Yes." She picked her book back up. Not because she was done with the conversation, he understood her enough by now to know that, but because she was thinking and she thought better with her hands occupied. He waited. "What would you do," she asked, "if it were someone else's town?" "I'd write down everything I know about how Holt's operation works, who his contacts in the Territorial Land Office are, and what the pressure campaign looks like at each stage, and I'd get that information to the people it concerns before Prout has time to set the first stage in motion." She looked at him. Her dark eyes were very direct. "And in your own town." He heard the words as she meant them. His own town. He let himself hear them without flinching away from the weight of them. "The same thing," he said. "And I'd stay to see it through." She nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do," she said. What followed was 2 weeks of careful, thorough work. Gideon wrote out everything he knew about Carver Holt's methods: the false land surveys, the contacts in county offices who could be bribed or pressured, the timing of the initial approach and what it typically looked like, and Jennie turned that information into letters. Not just any letters, precise, legally grounded, documented letters to the county commissioner, to the Territorial Land Office, to 2 lawyers in Santa Fe she had apparently developed a correspondence with through the Garza case, and to the editors of 2 territorial newspapers. She also, with a practicality that Gideon admired deeply, organized the ranchers. She brought together the Millers, the Averys, the Garzas, and 4 other neighboring families in the back room of Callaway's Dry Goods one Thursday evening, and explained the situation with clarity and without panic. And by the end of the evening, every family in the room understood exactly what a concerted land grab looked like and had agreed on how to respond. Cole Prout spent 10 days in Calico Flats making what looked like casual inquiries that were not casual at all. On the third day, he came into Callaway's while Gideon was there picking up supplies, and they saw each other across the store the way two men who know each other from a hard past see each other in a new place. "Prescott," Prout said. "Prout," Gideon said. "Didn't know you were here." "Here I am." A pause. Prout's eyes moved over Gideon the way a man calculates his options. "You working here?" "I live here," Gideon said, and the word landed between them like a stone into still water. Prout left the store without buying anything. He and his men rode out the next morning. 2 weeks later, a letter from Carver Holt's lawyer arrived at the county land office citing an interest in the North Creek properties. Jennie's letters to Santa Fe had already arrived. The county commissioner, who had ruled in the Garza family's favor and was perhaps developing a healthy respect for Jennie Hayes and her stack of papers, did not respond to Holt's lawyer in any encouraging way. The Miller family and the Avery family, both having taken Jennie's advice and had their existing land claims formally and correctly refiled, stood on solid legal ground. 3 months later, Carver Holt's operation turned its attention elsewhere. There were easier targets in the territory than a town with a schoolteacher who could read statutes and a former enforcer who knew every trick in the playbook. The North Creek stayed where it was. The Millers and the Averys stayed on their land. By then it was August. The summer rains had come through in July, and the schoolhouse roof Gideon had repaired had held perfectly, and the schoolhouse windows were open in the August heat, and the sound of children doing their lessons drifted out across Sycamore Street in a way that Gideon found himself slowing to listen to sometimes when he walked past. He was not dying. He was, in fact, doing the specific opposite of that, and he needed to reckon with it properly. He had been making that reckoning slowly, in the private way of a man who had spent a great deal of time alone with difficult thoughts. What he had arrived at, through many long nights and honest looking, was this: the things he had done in Carver Holt's service were real, and the harm they had caused was real, and he would carry the weight of that for the rest of his life. But the rest of his life was, apparently, continuing, and the question of whether he was allowed to live it, really live it, forward-facing and present and attached to a place and a person, was not, he had finally come to understand, a question he could answer alone. It was also not, if he was honest, a question he needed to answer alone. Because Jennie Hayes had known the shape of who he'd been from very early on, and had sat with him in her second porch chair anyway, and had said the word, "our town," with an ease that made his chest hurt in a different way than it used to. He found her on a Saturday morning in her kitchen garden, which was thriving in the summer heat, pulling weeds with the focused attention she brought to everything, and talking to herself under her breath about something he caught fragments of that seemed to involve the county's approach to teacher compensation. He stood at the gate. She looked up. "You have that look," she said. "What look?" "The one where you've been thinking about something serious for a long time and you've arrived somewhere." He opened the gate and walked into the garden, because standing at a gate for this conversation was not the right geometry for it. "Jennie," he said. She stood up from the weeds and brushed the dirt from her hands and waited with the steady patience of someone who had been waiting for this conversation without pressing it. "I came here to finish," he said. "I want you to know that I know how that sounds. And I want you to know that I am not that man anymore. Not because I fixed a roof or because I wrote down what I knew about Holt's operation, but because being in this town, he stopped, recalibrated. Being around you changed what I thought was possible, what I thought I was allowed to want." She was watching him with her full attention and no expression he could read yet. "I am not going to tell you I'm a good man," he said. "I don't know that I'm a good man. I know that I am trying to be. And I know that for the first time in a long time that trying feels like it might be going somewhere. And I know that you are," he paused again, because this was the part that was hardest, the most exposed, the most like the edge of something high. You are the loudest, most alive, most thoroughly present person I have ever encountered in my entire life, and being in proximity to all of that has made it impossible for me to hold on to the idea that mine was a life worth ending. You ruined the plan, Jennie, thoroughly and from day one, and I am grateful for it." The garden was quiet. The wind chime moved somewhere behind him. The August sun was warm and golden, and the mountains were blue-purple in the distance. "Gideon Prescott," she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady in a way he had never heard before, because Jennie Hayes was not a woman who came apart easily, but she was also not a woman who hid it when something genuinely mattered. "You are the most impossible, stubborn, quietly dramatic man I have ever met, and I have been sitting on my porch in the evenings hoping you would walk by on your way back from Tucker's livery since approximately April." He looked at her. Something enormous was moving inside his chest, loosening, like a knot that had been there long enough to feel like a permanent feature finally releasing. "You never said anything," he said. "You needed to get here yourself," she said. "I wasn't going to drag you." He laughed. It came out surprised and real, and it sounded strange in his own ears because he had not done it enough to be used to it. She smiled at the sound of it, wide and bright and entirely genuine. He crossed the small space between them and cupped her face in both his hands, and she reached up and took hold of his wrist with her ink-stained fingers. And when he kissed her, she kissed him back with the same wholehearted energy she brought to everything. And the garden smelled of earth and the herbs she grew and the warm desert air. And it was the single most alive moment Gideon Prescott had experienced in more years than he could easily count. "You have dirt on your face now," she said, when they separated, looking at him with those bright dark eyes. "I don't care," he said. She laughed, and the wind chime rang, and somewhere in the distance the mountains were steady and old and permanent. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Gideon Prescott's life, and he knew it while they were happening, which is a rare and particular kind of luck. He was not accustomed to that kind of luck, and he held it carefully, conscious of how unusual it was. He started sitting on the second porch chair in the evenings not as a visitor, but as a matter of course. They ate supper together more nights than not. She talked and he listened, and he talked and she listened, and they read in the same comfortable silence that good company produces. He helped her with the school where he could, repairing a broken desk and helping string up the new window covering she'd ordered from Santa Fe, and she helped him, more than she knew, simply by being what she was, every day, loud and present and impossibly full of life. He told her the rest of it, in the slower time of an honest relationship. The parts he had held back in the first telling, the specific names, the specific nights, the weight of each individual choice that had brought him to the West Texas road where Holt's man had put a bullet in his side. She listened to all of it without looking away, and without pretending it was lighter than it was. "The Delacroix family," she said one evening quietly. "Do you know where they went? Louisiana, I heard. They had family there. Have you considered writing to them?" He was quiet for a long time. "I've considered it." "You don't have to," she said. "And I understand if you can't yet. I'm just saying that sometimes the things we carry get lighter when we try to address them, not because it erases anything, but because it's honest." He wrote the letter in October. He wrote it for 3 evenings straight, destroying multiple drafts, before he had something he could send. He told the Delacroix family who he was and what role he had played and what he had known and had not stopped, and he told them he was sorry in the particular way that does not ask to be forgiven but simply insists on being said. He did not expect an answer. An answer came in December. It was from the elder Delacroix son, the one who had been shot, who was alive and working in New Orleans. The letter was not warm and it was not forgiving in any easy sense, but it was honest and it was human, and it said, among other things, that he did not spend his days thinking about the men who worked for Holt, that he had too much living to do for that, and that he had received the letter and he would keep it, and that was all he could say. Gideon read it at the kitchen table in Jennie's house. It had become, incrementally and without formal declaration, his kitchen table too. And Jennie sat across from him, and he handed her the letter when he'd finished, and she read it and set it down and reached across the table and put her hand over his. They sat like that for a while, with the December wind outside and the lamplight inside, and the quiet that had become, over these months, the best kind of quiet, full and warm and chosen. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday morning in January of 1883. He had planned something more elaborate and had abandoned it because elaborate gestures felt wrong for who they were. He did it simply at the breakfast table before the rest of Mrs. Garner's boarders were up, over coffee and the cold morning light, the way everything between them had happened directly and without performance. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to stay here in this town with you. I want to build something that lasts. I know what I've been and I know what I'm asking you to take on along with the rest of it, but I love you, Jennie Hayes. I love you with everything I have, which is not a small thing, even if I've been slow in the assembly of it." She looked at him across the table with her coffee in her hands and her hair not yet pinned for the day and her dark eyes steady and honest as the mountains. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. I have been waiting for you to ask since September." He stared at her. "September. I was not going to ask you myself because I knew you needed to get there, but Gideon, it has been 4 months since the garden." I was thinking deeply and taking it seriously. "Yes, I know you." She reached across the table and took his hand in hers, flower-dusted as always. "Yes, I will marry you. Now stop looking shocked. You must have had some idea." "I hoped," he said. "Good," she said. "Hoping is good. Keep doing that." They were married in March of 1883 in the Methodist church on the east end of Calico Flats, which was a modest building with whitewashed walls and windows that let in the spring light in long, clean rectangles. The minister was a practical man named Reverend Cole, who performed the ceremony with warmth and no unnecessary ornamentation, which both Gideon and Jennie appreciated. The entire town came. This was not a surprise. In a town the size of Calico Flats, a wedding was an event, but the specific texture of it was something Gideon had not anticipated. Maria and Louis Garza sat in the front row with their family. The Miller family came, and the Avery family. Mrs. Garner cried with the specific pleasure of someone who had watched this coming from week 1. Old Tucker from the livery wore a jacket that appeared to predate the Civil War and wore it with considerable dignity. Doc Alderman sat in the third row and looked satisfied with himself in the way of a man whose patient had exceeded all reasonable expectations of survival. Jennie walked down the aisle in a dress of ivory cotton she had made herself. It had taken 3 weeks and 2 letters to Santa Fe for the fabric. With her hair done properly for once, and a wreath of small desert flowers that Maria Garza had made for her, and she walked with the complete and characteristic unapologetic directness of a woman who knew exactly where she was going and was glad of it. Gideon stood at the front of the church in a dark coat he had bought from the traveling tailor who came through Calico Flats twice a year, and when she came down the aisle toward him, the light was on her face and her eyes found his immediately and did not leave them, and whatever composure he had assembled for the occasion did something complicated in his chest that he did not try to hide. They said their vows clearly and meant all of them. Outside the church afterward, with the spring sun warm and the whole town present and loud around them, Jennie stood in the light with her hand in Gideon's and her flowers and her inevitable flower-free dress, that day at least, and laughed at something Maria Garza said, and the sound of it carried across the churchyard and scattered the birds off the roof, and Gideon thought, "This is what alive sounds like." And he was grateful for every single inconvenient, unpredicted, wonderful day of it. They moved into Jennie's house, their house now, and set about making it properly shared. Gideon's few possessions occupied one corner of the bedroom, and then, slowly, distributed themselves throughout the rooms in the way that happens when a person stops treating a space as temporary. He built a proper bookcase for Jennie's overflowing collection of books. She turned the second bedroom into a study where she could grade papers and write her letters without covering the kitchen table. He continued at Tucker's Livery and the Miller Ranch, and by spring he was taking on additional horsework. He had a real skill with difficult horses, a patience and an instinct that were genuine rather than learned, and had begun to build a small local reputation for it. He was talking with Bill Miller about a possible long-term arrangement training horses for the ranch, which would give him steadier work and the kind of ongoing purpose that a man needed. Jennie continued teaching, continued writing letters that produced results, and continued being the specific and irreducible force of nature that she was in Calico Flats. The schoolhouse roof held through 2 rainstorms in spring. The county, in a development that she declared satisfying but inadequate, sent a modest amount of funding for school supplies. She wrote them a letter thanking them and simultaneously requesting more. This was so thoroughly in character that Gideon read the letter over her shoulder and felt something that was entirely and straightforwardly happiness. She told him about the baby in June. She told him in the kitchen, at the end of a regular evening, setting down the dish she was washing and turning to face him with an expression that was slightly more careful than her usual complete transparency, and he understood immediately that whatever she was about to say was something she was feeling out the edges of before she spoke it. "I think we're going to have a child," she said. He stood in the kitchen of their small adobe house with the evening light on the walls and the wind chime in the breeze outside, and his heart doing something that had no manageable description. And he looked at this woman, this extraordinary, loud, thoroughly alive woman who had destroyed his plan to disappear with nothing more than a stack of papers and a direct gaze and a second porch chair. And he crossed the kitchen and held her face in his hands the way he had in the garden a year ago and said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "Good," she said, and her eyes were bright and slightly wet. "Tired in the mornings, good." "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Some," she admitted. "But not more than I was of getting on the stage to come to the territory in the first place, and I was right to do that." "You were," he said. "You were absolutely right to do that." She laughed, a little unsteadily. "I never thought I would be one of those women who cried at good news." "You're not crying," he said. "I am slightly crying, Gideon, I can feel it." He pulled her close and held her in the kitchen with the evening outside and the small house around them, and the Sangre de Cristos in the distance. And he thought about the man who had ridden into this town a year ago with $3 and a bullet wound, and a certainty that he was finished. And he thought about how thoroughly wrong that man had been, and he was more grateful for being wrong than he had words for. Their son was born in February of 1884 on a cold, clear night when the stars over New Mexico were extraordinary. Doc Alderman presided with calm competence. Maria Garza was there, because Jennie had asked her, and Maria had simply appeared 3 hours before the labor progressed, as if she had known, and had been quietly and practically useful in the way that she was with everything. It was a long night. Gideon spent a significant portion of it in the front room of their house, unable to either sit still or go anywhere, while the sounds from the back room alternated between worrying and reassuring in turns. Doc Alderman came out twice with updates and returned to the back with the focused calm of a man who had done this many times in a territory where the nearest hospital was a long ride away. Their son arrived in the last hour before dawn and announced himself with a substantial and fully committed set of lungs that Gideon, standing in the front room, heard clearly through the walls and identified immediately as inherited from the correct parent. Doc Alderman appeared in the doorway. "Healthy boy," he said, with the quiet satisfaction that Gideon had come to understand was his version of exuberance. "Mother doing very well." They named him Thomas for Jennie's father. Gideon held Thomas James Prescott for the first time in the hour after dawn, while Jennie slept and Maria sat in the front room with her own quiet gratitude, and the baby was small and warm, and had a look of profound skepticism about the whole enterprise of the world that Gideon found both familiar and deeply funny. "You were worth every difficulty," he said to the baby, very quietly, "including arriving at 3 in the morning when the temperature was 15 degrees. I want you to know that." Thomas regarded him with the focused gravity of the very new, and then closed his eyes, apparently having gathered enough data. Jennie, when she woke, held their son with the complete and concentrated attention she brought to everything that mattered, and looked up at Gideon over the baby's head with an expression he had never seen on her face before and never would forget, full and still and radiant, the particular joy of a woman who was present in her life at its fullest. "Thomas," she said softly. "Hello, Thomas." The baby opened one eye, skeptically, and Gideon sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around his wife and watched his son, and listened to the morning sounds of Calico Flats beginning outside the window, and felt the full, settled, present weight of a life that was truly and abundantly his own. The months that followed found a new rhythm that was full and various. Thomas was a sturdy, bright baby who demonstrated very early a complete lack of interest in sleeping when other people thought he should, and a strong interest in watching everything that moved, which Gideon felt were both eminently sensible positions. Jennie returned to teaching in the fall. Maria Garza had offered to care for Thomas during school hours with such matter-of-fact warmth that declining would have been impossible, and the school year of 1884 was, by Jennie's own account, the best she had taught. Gideon's arrangement with Bill Miller had become a full partnership in the horse operation by that autumn. He had a genuine facility with it, not just the handling but the training, the patient building of trust between a horse and its purpose. And it was satisfying work in the specific way that comes from doing something you are actually meant to do. He had also, over the course of the year, become the kind of person in Calico Flats that people brought horse problems to without thinking about it. And this was a social position he had neither sought nor expected, and found himself entirely comfortable with. He had written 2 more letters to the Delacroix family in Louisiana, not asking for anything, but keeping the honesty alive. The elder son had written back once more briefly, to say that his leg still caused him difficulty in cold weather, but that he was working and had a family of his own, and that he considered the matter between himself and Gideon Prescott largely concluded. The younger son had not written, and Gideon did not expect him to and did not require it. He had done what he could. He had accepted what he could not. It was enough. Not perfect, not clean, not without the permanent mark of what had been. But enough, sufficient to stand on, sufficient to build from. In the spring of 1885, with Thomas walking and talking in the emphatic, declarative sentences of a child who has clearly been listening to Jennie Hayes since before birth, Gideon was coming back from the Miller Ranch on a clear Tuesday afternoon when he rode past the schoolhouse and heard, through the open windows, the sound of his wife teaching. She was doing history, he could tell from the questions, specific and enthusiastic questions about why things had happened and what the consequences had been. And the children were answering with the energy of a class that was genuinely engaged, and he sat on his horse for a moment in the April sun and listened to the back and forth of it. The quick, bright voice he knew better than any other voice in the world, moving through the room with precision and warmth. He thought about the man who had ridden into this town 4 years ago. He thought about $3 and a bullet wound and a plan for quiet. He thought about a flour-dusted woman on a leaning porch who had looked at him and pointed him toward a blue door without pausing in her own stride. He thought about a second chair on a porch, about a garden, about a marriage, about a boy who had his mother's lungs and his father's eyebrows, and was currently, by all accounts, learning to run, which was causing considerable concern to anyone in a 30-foot radius. He thought about all of it and understood, with the clean and settled certainty of a man who had finally arrived fully in his own life, that this was what he had been given, not a quiet ending in a forgotten corner of the territory, but a loud and living one, ongoing and open-handed and full. The following Sunday he found Jennie at the kitchen table with her correspondence and her coffee, and Thomas on the floor nearby, attempting to convince the dog to share his position, which the dog was tolerating with resigned dignity. "I've been thinking," Gideon said. She looked up. You have that look again. What look? The one where you've been thinking for some time and have arrived somewhere. He sat down across from her. Do you want more children, if we're lucky, if we're fortunate? She looked at him with those warm, steady eyes. Yes, she said without hesitation. I think Thomas should have a sibling. He's going to need someone to argue with who argues back with comparable intensity. I think he'll manage either way, Gideon said. He's 2 years old and he has opinions about which cup he uses for his water, Jennie said. He needs an equal. Gideon laughed, and she smiled at the laugh the way she always did. And Thomas looked up from his project with the dog and said something emphatic in the half-formed language of the very small. In the summer of 1886, their daughter arrived. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, and for no specific reason except that it sounded like itself, and seemed to suit the small, determined person who bore it. Clara was dark-haired and fierce from the very start, and she proved, as Jennie had predicted, to be an entirely adequate match for Thomas in the matter of opinions and their expression. They were 4 now, in the small adobe house that had grown a new room on the back and a proper porch that did not lean, and the kitchen garden had expanded into something genuinely productive, and the wind chimes still rang in the afternoon breeze, and the bookshelves were full, and the kitchen table had letters and lesson plans and horse records, and sometimes Thomas's small drawings scattered across it, and the mountains were the same mountains they had always been, red and blue and enormous against the New Mexico sky. Doc Alderman came to supper on Sundays when he was not needed elsewhere, and he and Gideon had developed the specific friendship of 2 private men who had found each other trustworthy, which was rare enough that both of them recognized it. Maria and Louis Garza came for Sunday meals often too, and their family had grown its own branches of friendship through Jennie's school and through the ordinary daily life of a town where people looked out for each other because the territory was vast and looking out was necessary. Calico Flats had grown by about 40 people in the 4 years Gideon had been there, and there was talk of a proper telegraph office and of extending the rail spur from the north. Jennie was corresponding with the county on behalf of the school about a second room and a second teacher, which she had decided was essential, and which the county was, in her view, taking an unacceptable time to consider. She had not changed her approach to the county and was not going to. She was still Jennie Hayes being the name she kept professionally for the school, because the children and their families knew her by it, and she had not seen the need to complicate things. And she was still the loudest, most present, most irreducibly alive person in Calico Flats and most likely in the territory. And she was still absolutely impossible to argue with and still always right about the barrel being in the wrong place. And she was his, and he was hers, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. He told her this one evening in autumn when the children were asleep, and the house was quiet with the particular full quiet of a household at rest, sitting on the porch in the 2 chairs with the desert cooling around them and the stars doing what stars in New Mexico do, which is be excessive and magnificent and entirely unreasonable. I owe you something, he said. She looked at him sideways. What? You ruined my plan, he said. The plan I came here with. I've thought about saying thank you for 4 years and it's never seemed sufficient, but I want to say it properly. Thank you, Jennie, for being too loud and too alive for that plan to survive. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars, and then she turned to look at him with an expression that held everything she was, the directness, the warmth, the deep and complete lack of interest in anything less than the full truth. You ruined my plan too, she said. I had a plan to spend the next 30 years being completely self-sufficient and slightly exhausting to everyone who knew me. You're still slightly exhausting, he said. Yes, but now I have help, she said, and took his hand, and they sat on the porch in the autumn dark with the wind chime and the stars and the sleeping children and the good, full, permanent weight of the life they had made. Far away in West Texas, Carver Holt's operation was slowly dismantling itself under the pressure of several very well-documented lawsuits and 2 particularly tenacious lawyers in Santa Fe. one of whom had been introduced to the details of Holt's land grab tactics through a correspondence with a schoolteacher in Calico Flats several years prior. Justice, as Gideon had long known, moved at its own pace and through its own channels, but it moved. The Delacroix family in Louisiana, Gideon would learn through a final letter the following spring, had bought back a parcel of land near their original home. The elder son had written to say this, briefly and without sentiment, but had written it, which Gideon understood as the kind of closing that was available and was therefore sufficient. And in Calico Flats, New Mexico Territory, in the year of 1887, on a May morning when the desert was flowering in the brief, brilliant way it did after the spring rains, Gideon Prescott got up before the sun and went out to the porch and watched the light come over the mountains the way he had watched it come every morning for 5 years. He heard the screen door behind him. Thomas, who was 3.5 and resolutely against missing anything, had gotten out of bed without being heard, which was an increasing feature of his daily operating method. He came to the edge of the porch and stood beside his father and looked at the mountains with the focused, serious attention he brought to the world, which was something he had, Gideon thought, from both of them. "Mountains," Thomas said, pointing in the declarative way. "Yes," Gideon said. "Big. Very big." Thomas considered this satisfactory and leaned against Gideon's leg with the specific boneless trust of a small child who knows exactly where the safe places are. Gideon put his hand on his son's head, warm and small and present. Behind them, through the open window, Clara made a sound that preceded waking, and inside the house Jennie's voice, low and full of morning warmth, said something quiet and then said it again as Clara decided that being awake was a reasonable condition and began the process of communicating this to everyone within range. The sun came over the Sangre de Cristos and lit the desert gold. The wind chime rang once, clear and small in the morning air. Gideon Prescott had come to the territory to die quietly. He had built a life instead, a loud and warm and permanent one, full of children and mountains and letters to county commissioners and meals that ran long into the evening, and a woman who was too alive to let the world around her settle into anything less than its full potential. He was grateful for every single day of it. He was grateful for all the days that were still to come. He leaned down and picked up his son, who grabbed his collar with small, certain hands, and went back inside to his family and his life, and the door closed behind him, and the morning continued, wide and gold and full.